Hey everybody, Dr. Val here. It's been a while since I've put up a new video here, but I'm back on. Okay, I have a couple things that I want to share today. I just gave a talk this past weekend at an event, and I'm going to kind of summarize what I talked about. And any of these topics you could dive really deep into, but I was trying to give people a really good overview. People who are not at all aware of the perspective that I'm coming from, functional medicine, and getting to the root cause. So the whole thing was on emotional wellness. And so my talk focused on what are big areas in your body that you have control over that can affect your emotional well-being and emotional health. And I listed three things, but really there's four, and I left it out just because there just wasn't time. Diet, relating to gut health specifically, inflammation, and stress. And my fourth one would be toxins. Okay. And diet obviously is huge if you know anything about the gut microbiome. And we know that there's so much interplay between the gut and the brain that we now call it the gut-brain axis. You'll see it in studies. You'll see lots of research referring to the gut-brain axis. That's meaning there is so much communication going both ways between these two, and it has such an impact on not only brain health, but gut health as well, and how happy the brain is can really influence your microbiome and your gut lining, and the happiness of the tissue. But a lot of chemicals get released, either made directly by the bugs in your gut, that will either stimulate neurologically or chemically back to the brain. And really important things we all think of, well, serotonin, because 80 to 90%, depending on the study you read, of the precursors for serotonin come directly from the bugs in your gut. They make that get circulated up, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and your brain takes that precursor molecule, 5-HT, turns it into serotonin. There's another pathway as well, also involving the gut. So most of the serotonin in your brain is coming from the bugs in your gut. And we know that elevating levels of serotonin is kind of a feel-good, mood uplifting chemical. And that's what most of the drugs for depression are arranged around. They are SSRIs, which is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which basically is fancy terminology for it's trying to prolong the serotonin in the brain between one neuron and another. Chemicals get released across this little gap in these little packets, and the drug is meant to increase the amount of time that the serotonin spends out here, where it can have influence in the next nerve. And so it acts like you have more than you really do. But the bottom line may not be that you don't have enough. Well, bottom line may not be in the brain, it's in the gut, because that's where most of the precursors are coming from. So, but what is really cool is there's all these other metabolites or chemicals that are specific, made in the gut, affecting the brain. It affects the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. It affects the brain's sort of immune system. The microglia in the brain, which are more than 50% of the cells, are kind of like the brain's immune system. They will upregulate inflammatory markers. They're kind of like not centaurs, sentinels. They're on the lookout for things that are awry. Once they get triggered, it can cause brain-wide inflammation. Chemicals in your gut and microbiome are also responsible for basically influencing the neuroplasticity. That's really how the neurons build and stimulating new connections to each other, stimulating circulation. All of those messages are coming from the gut microbiome to the brain. So that was a big topic, basically, to try to incorporate, And so what you're eating is directly affecting the gut microbiome. And ways of influencing the microbiome are things like eating fermented food, cut out processed carbs and processed sugars. Just a lot of things that most of you that follow me already know that influences the gut microbiome. So another thing that I said was inflammation. Inflammation can be in the brain or it can be in the body, and those markers go to the brain. So direct brain inflammation from like heavy metals, mercury for one. A lot of heavy metals get stuck and attracted to, stored away in specific tissues. Lead goes to the bone and other things, but the mercury goes to the brain, and once in the brain it changes form and it becomes inorganic, and then it can't get out. There's no bodily way of pulling that mercury out. Well, once it's there, it's kind of like a sliver. The body knows it's not supposed to be there, so it creates this area of inflammation. And so when you're constantly exposed to little bits of mercury, whether it's from fillings, whether it's from environment, wherever you're picking that up, you can have just this low-level chronic brain inflammation directly. And that affects mood. It affects all of your other neurotransmitter viability and efficiency. So when you have a lot of inflammation in the brain, it decreases the efficiency and the effectiveness of the neurotransmitters to move around. It depletes the body's, well, let's just say the body's energy is not in making more neurotransmitter, it's in going into this inflammation. So you end up with basically, from the inflammation, you end up with decreased neurotransmitters across the board that are effective in doing their job. It slows down transit, does a lot of things. So brain inflammation is not good. So it can be directly from the brain, and that's just one example. Another would be how it's coming from the body. The brain gets inflamed because in the body, your immune system, and in the brain, but in the body, the immune system is responsible for, alerting, sending out these little red flag messengers, cytokines. They're inflammatory markers. They're like the little red flags. Some of them are stuck to cells or tissue that's like, this is damaged, come back and fix this. And others just get thrown around into the bloodstream and they go all over the place. So cytokines, those inflammatory markers, get circulated all around. What's fascinating, though, is that they cross the blood-brain barrier. Once inside the brain, then the brain upregulates its inflammatory, alert system. And so you end up with brain inflammation because of the body. So what's feeding body inflammation? Sugar. Dietary intake, sugar really, really drives that mechanism of inflammation. For a great explanation of that, read the book Wheat Belly by William Davis. It's been around a long time, and it explains the mechanism of wheat and sugar as well. But wheat has kind of a different mechanism, but it's rapidly turned into sugar in the body. So wheat and sugar are the two most inflammatory things that you can do to your body, but that also goes straight to your brain. So diet also then plays a role in decreasing inflammation. So there's a lot of things that feed that inflammatory pathway. If you're sedentary, if your lifestyle feeds into how inflammatory your body is. So it's not just one magic thing, but when it comes to diet, sugar and wheat feed that more than anything else. And then stress, and this was fascinating as I dove a little bit deeper into the effects of cortisol and what it does specifically with the neurotransmitters. So all those precursors for neurotransmitters are coming from your gut up to your brain. Cortisol basically cuts that off and says, nope, don't care about that. We have a crisis. We have to focus on this. And if you know anything about the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic fight or flight side of your brain, or not, side of your what's being told to the rest of the organs from the brain, or the parasympathetic rest and digest. There's two states, and your body kind of goes back and forth and is supposed to spend time more in the parasympathetic, right? Your fight or flight mechanism is only supposed to come up when you have a crisis. The problem is in our environment, we have crisis after crisis after crisis, and it may not be in the form of a tiger crouched around the corner coming to jump on you, or a robber coming into your house, or something that dramatically happens. It's also chemical. It's also emotional. It's a fight with your spouse. It's a work environment that stresses you out. Those kind of stressors, or it's a exposure from cleaning chemicals every time you drag everything out and you're inhaling all this and it's absorbing through your skin. That is a crisis. And the body only has one way to respond. It revs up all of the sympathetic fight or flight mechanisms, all of them. There's no like just a little, it's all or nothing. You're sympathetic or you're parasympathetic. And yes, it's a teeter totter. So there's different degrees of that, but that fight or flight mechanism is in play constantly. When you open a bill from the doctor's office and you're like, oh my word, how am I going to pay for this? When you get a flat tire, when you have to go to work and you hate it, when you find yourself in situations, and it's constantly throughout the day, throughout the day, throughout the day, throughout the day. So chronic inflammation is horrible for your bodies. That being in chronic stress drives up inflammation. Cortisol spikes your sugar. Sugar is driving inflammation. Cortisol itself is driving a lot of the inflammation. And when you're in that fight or flight, the brain, because it's all on one side, the brain also decreases the work that the gut does. So it slows down all of the digestive enzymes. It slows down the motility in your gut to move things around. It slows down the secretions that line the edge of the gut lining. So that makes the microbes unhappy. You're not digesting your food well. Lots of people that come in with chronic constipation or gut issues, you could relate it right back to stress because stress trumps everything. You can be eating right. You can be exercising 5 times a week. But if there is an area of chronic stress in your life, it's undoing a lot of the benefit that you're going to get on a cellular level. So stress is huge, but stress really magnifies inflammation. It's driving it up in the body and in the brain. It's blocking neurotransmitters. Chronic stress actually makes your brain shrink. There were studies done and they measured, brain tissue, and there's certain things that get spiked when you're stressed, like glutamate, and high levels of glutamate actually destroy neurons, and they would watch the tissue just shrink. So it literally shrinks your brain. You're not doing yourselves any favor when you are stressed. And there's lots of ways to deal with stress, whether it's external or internal. There's a lot of, whatever your mechanism is. Another thing, my fourth thing that really influences your emotions has to do with toxins. So I mentioned mercury, but there's a lot of toxins in the body that because you eat all the time, the body can never actually pull those, liver toxins. It can't pull those things out and flush them out. It can't repair damage. And so toxins in the body can be, well, they can't be ignored. Sometimes you can be doing all of the above things and you're like, I just can't get past this. What is going on? And it could be that there's toxins in the body. And there's certain ways to safely detox, and there's ways that can just mix the pot up more, and you'll have more symptoms, and it will just redistribute what's in your body. So there's a safe way to detox, and there's a safe way to help wake up all those pathways to pull the toxins from the tissue, capture them, make sure that they are captured, make sure everything's doing its job to pull it all the way completely out of the body. So toxins is really big, but those four things are probably huge for, you name it, any chronic disease. I would start with those things. But when it comes to emotions, the pathways in the neurotransmitters and how those are disrupted is pretty fascinating, actually. And I found it really interesting as I looked up study after study after study on brain function, how it relates to stress and how it relates to diet and how it relates to the gut microbiome and how, all these things so closely affect our brain. Nothing in our body is really in isolation of anything else. One of the studies that I looked up was on rats. It was done a few years ago. And they took rats and they fed them the most inflammatory food proteins that you could: milk, corn, and wheat. There's a reason that they picked those three. They're highly inflammatory. Conventional dairy, milk, corn, which 98% of all corn products in this country are GMO, which makes them highly inflammatory. And wheat being very, very, very inflammatory in the gut lining and the microbes themselves. So they took those three things, and after eating those proteins, they measured the levels of serotonin in the rat brains, and they found a drop in serotonin level in the brain within 2.5 hours of eating. And they fed them all three. So, they couldn't, I wish they had done a study where they'd broken it down and they've only done corn, only done milk, only done wheat, but they didn't. But within 2.5 hours of eating milk, corn, wheat, staples of the American diet, right? That the serotonin levels in their brain dropped. Now, that was not a human study. We extrapolate a lot from mice and rats because there's a lot in their anatomy that's similar to ours. And so we have a lot of disease models that we look at using rats and mice specifically. So, it's fascinating, and it's probably the inflammatory mechanisms, not how it's affecting the neurotransmitters coming from the gut. Because if you eat something in 2.5 hours, it's not all the way to your colon yet. But the inflammatory response is starting in your mouth for wheat when you're chewing, because of the proteins in wheat. They start breaking down directly while you're chewing them and starts absorbing into your bloodstream. And so it's starting that sugar raise, which immediately triggers inflammation. So you have just all these things that are probably happening early on in the digestion of those foods, that all are driving inflammation. If inflammation spikes, you have a drop in serotonin within 2.5 hours. So that was just a fascinating bit of research that I found while I was preparing for this talk last weekend. So anyway, those are 4 things that drive that. If you have questions or thoughts, post it below. I am going to try to get back on here to be doing videos on a regular basis now. If there's certain topics that you want to hear about, share them. But, my big areas of interest specifically in helping people has to do with fasting, has to do with diet, and those things can get to a lot of the root cause of why we have these chronic diseases. Decreasing inflammation goes back to diet, safe detox, and part of that is fed by diet. So there's a lot of things to unpack with everything I just said, but that's kind of an overview. So anyway, that's all I have for today. I hope everybody has an awesome day, and I'll see you next time.